start with a little bit of the background for why I looked into this particular question. Steve mentioned this work that I did interviewing Indonesian seminary students about their attitudes towards vernacular languages and vernacular language scriptures in their future ministries. Interviewed 30 different students representing 12 different language groups across Indonesia, from Papua to Sumatra. All but one of the students were from language groups that actually had translations in their own languages. And so, on the one hand, I found out that these students were highly committed to using local languages in their future ministry for all the reasons that we could probably predict. Showing respect, making connections, communication, and everything like that. When we got to the local language translations, however, I found that virtually none of the students actually had a copy of their translation on campus, and those few that did weren't actually using them. And when I asked, well, why aren't you using your own translation, at least for your personal devotions, the common response was, well, we just don't understand it as well as we do the Indonesian translation. Kind of set me back on my heels a little bit, and I thought, I really need to get into this more. I need to understand more about why they're saying this. And the first step in that process was the research that led to this paper. Is the notion that first languages offer communicative and emotive advantages over second languages valid in contexts where proficient early bilingualism is the norm? And by early proficient bilingualism, I mean the people start learning their second language very early in life, often before school or when they start school, and they develop a high level of fluency to the level of native speaker fluency in that language. So in the paper, I break this down basically into two parts, one looking at the comprehension side, the other looking at the emotive side. And the first part, is the first language more comprehensible than the second language among proficient early bilinguals? There's been a lot of work done in second language acquisition, and a lot of it focuses on this critical period hypothesis. The critical period hypothesis states that humans are endowed with a heightened sensitivity and ability to learn languages during a bounded period in their lives. Those of us, and probably many of you, have been in the situation where you've taken small children into a second language area and watched them just kind of sponge it all up, understand the critical period hypothesis. After 20 years in Papua New Guinea, with all the drills and all the intentional language learning and all the hard work that I did, I still had people coming up to me and saying, boy, your kids talk just like us, but you... There's an element that when we start that late, we're outside of that critical period, and it's harder and harder and harder to develop true native speaker fluency. The critical period hypothesis, if you graph it out, looks something like this. And this applies not only to humans and language learning, but it's also been found in a number of different other species learning different elements. I mentioned one of those in the paper. But there's an onset period in which the sensitivity increases. Then there's the critical period, during which we're particularly able to do whatever, in this case, learn languages. And then there's the beginning of the offset period, where that sensitivity slowly decreases. For language learning in humans, really the onset period is pretty much birth. So the critical period is from birth to some point out here, and the research that's been done into the critical period hypothesis has really done a good job of identifying what that point is, and after that point, we begin to lose our ability to attain native speaker fluency in a second language. There's two predictions from this critical period hypothesis. The first is that only those who start learning the second language during that critical period have the capacity to develop native speaker fluency across all components of the language. That'd be phonology, that'd be morphosyntax, that'd be lexicon. The second prediction from the critical period hypothesis that I don't really deal with in this paper is that there should be a leveling off. After the offset period, our ability to learn languages should level off, and continue at some level for the rest of our lives. That actually, a number of studies have said that that's not true, that we keep getting worse and worse at learning languages the older we get. And I can sort of testify to that. Learning Bahasa Indonesia at 60 is way different than learning the Papua New Guinea language that we learned back in our 30s. Much more difficult. So the critical period hypothesis and ultimate fluency. Studies have shown that there is an age beyond which achieving native speaker fluency in a language is unlikely. And different language components, that is phonology, morphosyntax, and lexicon, show different offsets. There's an interesting study by Granena and Long, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that looked at these offset periods for those three components and discovered that the phonology offset ended about the age of 12, while the lexis and collocational offset ended somewhere between the ages of 9 and 12, and the morphosyntax offset ended somewhere in the mid-teens. So each component of language learning had a different slope on that graph, but all of the offsets started about age 6. So if we're going to learn a language, it's best to do it before the age of about 6 or 7. Now, I'm not saying that those who start later cannot achieve fluency in the language. Of course we can. Many of us have been in that situation where we've learned a language at 20 or 30 or beyond and gotten quite good at it. But the focus of this paper is specifically on those proficient early bilinguals, asking the question, are they able to attain the same level of fluency in the second language as they are in the first language? And the answer to that question really is yes, as long as they start before that offset period starts, at about age 6 or 7. Children who begin learning the second language before the start of the age of the offset are capable of achieving native speaker fluency across all components of the second language. Those who do achieve native speaker fluency should be able then to comprehend the second and the first language equally well. If they're native speaker fluent in both languages, then the first language should not offer any particular comprehensive advantages over the second language, is the conclusion for that. Now, all of this depends on several other factors, one of which is the length of exposure to the second language. For example, if you pop into school and sit in lessons for 3 years and drop out of school, no, you're not going to get there. But if you start at the age of 6 or 7 exposed to the language or before and continue that exposure in natural social context through for the rest of your life, yes, there's a good chance that you can achieve native speaker fluency. The second piece of my paper attempted to ask the question, is the first language more emotive than the second language among proficient early bilinguals? And there's been a number of studies, and perhaps you've seen some of them, that said that looked at this question of bilinguals and concluded that the emotional impact, the emotiveness of the first language is greater than that of the second language. There was a 2003 study of Turkish speakers, and these young people started learning English in high school or college, came to the U.S. for studies. The study looked at the relative emotiveness of those two languages, Turkish and English, and found that yes, indeed, in this case, the first language, Turkish, was more emotive than the second language, English. When, however, the studies control for the age of acquisition and for the learning context, that emotive advantage of the first language tends to disappear. There's one study by Caldwell Harris and friends in 2011 that looked at Mandarin English bilinguals. 53% of those who learned English after the age of 12 stated that Mandarin was the more emotive of the two languages, while only 6% of that sample claimed that English was more emotive. But if you turn it and look at those who began learning English before the age of 5, 67% of those people claimed that English and Mandarin were equally emotive. So the first language emotive advantage disappears when you get back before that age of offset. Another study by Harris, no relation, in 2004, Spanish-English bilinguals, measured the reactions to 4 categories of emotional expressions, that is, taboo words, reprimands, endearments, and insults. Those who began learning English in mid to late childhood expressed that Spanish was more emotive. But those who began learning English earlier expressed that English and Spanish were equally emotive. That is, once again, you get before that age of onset. Early language acquisition equates to a loss of that emotive difference between those two languages. Now, there's been several factors that have been found to relate to the emotiveness of language. One is the formal versus natural social learning context. And what I mean by that, if you just sit in a classroom, a typical college classroom or high school classroom, and learn a language in that context without ever going out into natural social context and relating with people in that language, the second language is probably going to be less emotive than the first. What they found is that the connection between the language learning and the emotive or emotional laden context within which it is learned is very, very important. So if you're going out and we're talking with our friends in the second language, we're getting insulted in the second language, we're having emotional experiences in the second language, what that does is connects that language with the emotions. And the more that happens, the more emotive that second language becomes. So the context in which the language is learned is very important. That is, whether it's just a formal context or whether it's also an emotionally laden, natural, social context. Proficiency, of course, is an important factor. And language dominance is also an important factor. And probably that's because language dominance also relates back to natural, social contexts of use. Thinking about the university friends that we have in Bandung, Indonesia. These are all engineering students. They're all out of their language groups, living in a Sundanese area where Indonesian is the primary language that they speak. Indonesian has become their dominant language because most of the people that they interact with day to day are not from their language group. And so all of those emotionally laden experiences that occur throughout their day-to-day existence are going to be experienced in the second language. It's becoming the more dominant language, and that then, like I say, makes those connections between emotionally laden experience and language. So when we learn a language in a natural social context, we tend to experience these emotionally laden events in that language, and that produces those connections. So is the first language more emotive than the second language among proficient early bilinguals? Well, the emotiveness of the language largely depends on proficiency and the context in which it was learned, and also, I might add, the language dominance. Proficient early bilinguals who learn the second language in emotionally rich, natural contexts are likely to experience similar levels of emotional impact in the first and the second language. So just a few conclusions from this. Basically, in contexts like this, where we're dealing with proficient early bilinguals who are equally fluent in both their mother tongue and a second language, that first language may not offer comprehension or emotive advantages over the second languages in these kinds of areas where proficient bilingualism is the norm. And that leads us to a translation question. If translations are needed in this context, it's probably not going to be because of any potential comprehensive or emotive benefits of that translation. It's going to be for other reasons. People still might prefer, for example, vernacular translation because of the identity issues. Even though it might not be any more understandable than the national language translation, they just might prefer it because of that. There might be contextualization reasons for doing a vernacular translation that go beyond the comprehensive and emotive issues. It may, however, be that translations in the language of wider communication or the national language are all that's needed in a particular language group. I mean, it could be that in some of these languages in Indonesia, represented by the students in my original study, that they can get by, they and their communities and their churches can get by very well in using the Indonesian translation. It's certainly something that we need to look at. We may need to take an incremental kind of a taste and see approach to determining whether or not a translation is needed in contexts like this, and if so, what form is it going to be? And finally, I don't have it on the slide, but I think we need to just be cautioned against generalization when it comes to describing these language groups and the need for translations in these language groups. These language groups in Indonesia, some of them that were represented in this study were 1.2,600,000. These are not homogeneous language groups. Even though the students that I studied were proficient bilinguals, it's very probable that there are other components or other groups within that language group who are not. And so we don't want to generalize about any particular language group, but what we need to do is involve the community in evaluating the needs and the possibilities of translation in every group and take each one individually. Thank you.